Hi, welcome back. In our previous lesson, we started with deriving the Marshallian, Hicksian, and Slutsky demand curves. We focused on the Marshallian demand curve. Now we'll be moving on to part 2 where we'll focus on the Hicksian demand curve. We said that the Marshallian demand function or the demand curve, it shows the quantity of a good that a consumer will buy given their budget, assuming utility maximization. The Hicksian demand curve shows the quantity of a good a consumer would buy to achieve a fixed level of utility at the lowest possible cost. This is popularly called expenditure minimization, which we will look at in detail in subsequent lessons. The aim here is to identify a level of utility and find the minimum expenditure given that level of utility. The Hicksian demand curve is sometimes called the compensated demand curve because it is usually constructed by adjusting income as price changes so as to keep the consumer's utility constant. Hence, the consumer is compensated for the price changes and his utility is the same at every point on the Hicksian demand curve. Now let's move on to a graphical representation of this curve. Let's recall that this was our Marshallian demand curve which we derived in our previous lesson. For our Hicksian demand, if we start from the budget constraint B1 and the equilibrium point E1 and indifference curve U1 and assume the price of good X increases from P1 to P2. This moves us to a new equilibrium point E2 on a budget constraint B2 and indifference curve U2 is lower than U1. To find the Hicksian demand curve, we have to give the consumer enough income so that they can reach their original level of utility represented on indifference curve U1 despite the change in price. This is what we call the substitution effect in our previous lessons. So we do this by drawing an imaginary budget line that is parallel to the new budget line B2. So we call this imaginary budget line BL. Now, this imaginary budget line represents compensation for the price change. To draw this imaginary budget line, we'll compensate the consumer with enough income, and even more income up until the indifference curve U1 is tangential to the budget line. At this new budget line BL, the relative prices have changed, but the consumer is on the same indifference curve U1. The consumer is compensated with enough income until they have enough money to afford the original level of utility U1 despite the change in price. So there is a new point of tangency, which is EH. This new point of tangency EH tells us the demand for good X when the consumer had been compensated enough so that they can still achieve utility level U1 even though the relative prices have changed. This level of demand for good X represents the pure substitution effect of the increase in the price of good X. So this is called the Hicksian demand for good X, and we will label it as XH. We derive the Hicksian demand curve by projecting this XH to the demand diagram. We can represent this as XH over here. We are moving from X1 to XH, which is our substitution effect. Note that this is the compensated demand for good X when the price is P2. So to get the Hicksian demand curve, we simply need to connect this point A here to our new point C here. Let's call this curve DH. So if we compare the Hicksian demand, which is DH, to a Marshallian demand, which is DM, we notice that the Hicksian demand curve is steeper than the Marshallian demand curve. Now, this is the case when the good is a normal good, and we will talk about it more in our subsequent lessons. This is all that we have on the second part of deriving the Marshallian, Hicksian, and Slutsky demand curves. Our next lesson will be on part 3, where we focus on the Slutsky demand curve. If you enjoyed today's lesson, consider subscribing. Thank you.